Dr. Zenvox's smirk deepened, but he remained silent. Then we have the preposterous notion of human pack bonding, Vel-Nossian continued, clearly warming to his subject. Their mythology claims they form emotional attachments to virtually any creature they encounter, including species that pose direct threats to their survival. They allegedly adopt predators as companions, nurse wounded enemies back to health, and form familial bonds with beings that should logically view them as prey. The display showed artists' renderings of humans interacting with various dangerous creatures, each image more ridiculous than the last. A human child playing with something that looked suspiciously like a miniature version of the galaxy's most feared apex predator. An adult human sharing food with a creature whose species had historically consumed human-like beings. A human medic treating the wounds of an enemy soldier mid-battle. Evolutionary nonsense, the professor declared, with the kind of certainty that makes the universe laugh. Such behavior would have been selected against within a few generations. No species survives by befriending everything that moves. The audience was fully engaged now, some taking notes, others nodding along with the professor's reasoning. It all made perfect sense from a scientific standpoint, which should have been the first indication that something was about to go spectacularly wrong. Perhaps most absurd of all, Vel-Nossian continued, his prismatic form now cycling through what could only be described as the colors of academic superiority, are the tales of human ingenuity under pressure. According to their mythology, when faced with impossible circumstances, humans allegedly devise solutions using whatever materials happen to be available, often in ways that violate several fundamental principles of engineering. The display showed what appeared to be technical diagrams of impossible contraptions, jury-rigged devices that should never have functioned, and repair work that seemed to have been performed by someone who had never heard of proper engineering protocols. The myth claims they once repaired a critical life support system using nothing but scavenged parts and something they call percussive maintenance, Vel-Nossian said, his tone dripping with academic disdain. They allegedly refer to this technique as hitting it until it works, which should tell you everything you need to know about the scientific rigor involved. More chuckles from the audience. Even the energy beings seemed to pulse with amusement. And then, the professor continued, clearly building to what he considered his masterpiece of debunking, we have the ultimate human myth, their supposed ability to survive in environments that should be instantly fatal, often through what they call stubbornness or spite. The display shifted to show scenarios that did seem genuinely impossible. Humans surviving in hard vacuum for short periods, walking away from crashes that should have been immediately fatal, continuing to function despite injuries that would incapacitate most species. Hull's particularly ridiculous tale claims that a human once survived for several days in space after their ship exploded, using only their emergency suit and what they described as creative problem-solving and a really bad attitude. Vel-Nossian said, the biological impossibilities alone. He never got to finish that sentence. The lecture hall's communication system suddenly crackled to life, filled with static and what sounded distinctly like someone humming an upbeat tune. The interference cleared just enough for a cheerful human voice to emerge from the speakers. Hello there, any friendly aliens in the neighborhood? This is Commander Brick Ironwood of the human vessel Definitely Not Stolen, requesting emergency assistance. We've had some minor technical difficulties and could use a hand if anyone's got a spare docking bay. The auditorium fell silent. Professor Vel-Nossian's prismatic form flickered through colors that suggested confusion, mixed with the kind of panic that comes from having reality intrude upon a perfectly good lecture. This appears to be an actual human transmission, Dr. Zenvox observed helpfully, his 6 arms folded in a way that suggested he was enjoying this development immensely. Possible, Vel-Nossian sputtered. There are no human vassals in this system. I checked the traffic manifests personally. The transmission continued, now joined by a second voice with a distinctly different accent. Commander, I've got the quantum flux capacitor jury-rigged with some spare wiring, and that emergency chocolate you've been saving should get us another few hours of life support. Excellent work, Engineer Lunar Stormwright, came the cheerful reply. Though I have to ask, what did you use for the stabilizing matrix? Well, you know how the manual says never to use organic compounds in quantum field manipulation? Please tell me you didn't. I used the chocolate Turns out cocoa has some really interesting properties when exposed to exotic matter. Who knew? Several audience members turned to stare at Professor Vel-Nossian, whose confidence was beginning to develop some distinctly visible cracks. This is clearly a hoax, he declared, though his voice carried slightly less conviction than before. Someone is obviously attempting to disrupt my presentation with fabricated transmissions. Oh, and Commander, the engineer's voice continued. Remember that black hole we skirted to avoid the Voidstalker patrol? Turns out we picked up some hitchhikers, the friendly kind or the kind that wants to eat us. Bit of both, actually. The crystalline refugees we rescued are very grateful, but they're sharing space with some kind of energy parasite that seems to think we're delicious. I've got it contained for now using a magnetic field generator I built from the coffee machine. You built a magnetic field generator from the coffee machine? Don't worry, it still makes coffee. Had to sacrifice the timer function, but priorities, right? The color spectrum currently being displayed by Professor Vel-Nossian could charitably be described as academic horror with undertones of existential crisis. This is becoming ridiculous, he announced to the auditorium. Clearly someone has hacked our communication systems too. Institute control to unknown human vessel, came a new voice over the speakers, this one belonging to the station's traffic coordinator. Please state the nature of your emergency and your current location. Oh, hey there, Institute Control. Lovely to hear from you. We're currently about 3 kilometers off your port docking array. As for our emergency, well, that's a bit of a story. See, we were en route to the Centauri system when we detected a distress signal from what turned out to be a passenger liner caught in a gravitational anomaly near that black hole cluster in the Vega sector. The Vega sector black hole cluster is classified as utterly lethal to all known forms of life, the traffic coordinator responded, sounding increasingly confused. Right, well, that's what we thought too, but Luna here figured out how to surf the gravitational waves using our emergency thrusters and some creative modifications to our inertial dampeners. Bit bumpy, but we managed to extract all 47 survivors before their ship got spaghettified. Professor Vel-Nossian was now cycling through colors that didn't technically exist in normal space-time, which was probably not a good sign. You surfed gravitational waves around a black hole cluster? The traffic coordinator asked weakly. Had to improvise the approach a bit, Engineer Stormwright chimed in. Turns out if you reverse the polarity on the field generators and feed the excess energy back through the navigation computer, you can create a kind of gravitational surfboard effect. The math is actually pretty elegant, once you ignore about half the safety protocols. You ignored safety protocols while navigating a black hole cluster, only the boring ones. We kept all the important bits about not dying horribly. Dr. Zenvox was now openly laughing, a sound like crystal chimes being played by someone with a wicked sense of humor. Several other audience members were beginning to look uncomfortable, shooting glances between the speakers and their increasingly distressed presenter. This is obviously some kind of elaborate prank, Professor Vel-Nossian declared, though he was beginning to sound less like a confident academic and more like someone trying to convince himself that reality wasn't personally targeting him for humiliation. Institute Control, we're also carrying some refugees who specifically requested to speak with someone from your Xenological department, Commander Ironwood continued cheerfully. Apparently they have some stories about human behavior they'd like to share for research purposes. What kind of stories? The traffic coordinator asked, though something in their tone suggested they were beginning to suspect they didn't want to know. Well, there's the one about how we convinced a pack of Voidstalkers to let us pass by teaching them poker, the commander replied. And the time Luna here fixed their ship's quantum drive using nothing but spare parts and what she called aggressive optimism. Oh, and they're particularly impressed by how we managed to domesticate that energy parasite I mentioned. You domesticated an energy parasite? Wasn't really trying to, Engineer Stormwright explained, just kept feeding it small amounts of our excess power and talking to it like it was a pet. Turns out it was just lonely. We're calling it Sparky now. It's actually pretty helpful once you get to know it. The silence in the auditorium was becoming almost tangible. Professor Vel-Nossian appeared to be experiencing what could only be described as an academic nervous breakdown, his crystalline form flickering between colors that suggested profound philosophical crisis. Permission to dock granted, the traffic coordinator said finally, sounding like someone who had given up trying to make sense of the universe. Bay 7 is available for your use. Brilliant. We'll be there in a few minutes. Fair warning though, our docking approach might look a bit unconventional. Our landing thrusters got damaged during the black hole thing, so Luna rigged up an alternative system using our waste recycling unit and some spare hull plating. You're using your waste recycling unit for propulsion? It's actually surprisingly effective once you adjust the pressure ratios. Plus, it's environmentally friendly. That's not how environmental friendliness works in space. Details, see you in a few. The transmission cut out, leaving the auditorium in stunned silence. Professor Vel-Nossian stood frozen at his podium, his holographic display still showing neat charts and graphs that explained exactly why everything they had just heard was scientifically impossible. Dr. Zenvox finally broke the silence. "Well, this should be interesting," he said, his 6 arms now openly applauding. "Colleagues, I believe we're about to witness the first real-time debunking of a debunking in academic history." "This is not happening," Professor Vel-Nossian muttered, his prismatic form now displaying what could only be described as the color of denial. "This is simply not happening." Unfortunately for the professor's peace of mind, the universe had apparently decided that it was in fact happening, and was prepared to double down on the concept with interest. 20 minutes later, the auditorium's viewing screens activated automatically as the Institute's external sensors detected an approaching vessel. What they showed defied several fundamental principles of spacecraft design, basic engineering, and arguably good taste. The human ship looked like it had been assembled by someone who had heard spacecraft described second-hand and decided to improvise. Hull plating had been replaced with what appeared to be repurposed cargo containers. The propulsion system consisted of several different types of thrusters that definitely hadn't been designed to work together, along with what looked suspiciously like industrial equipment that was definitely not supposed to be attached to the exterior of a spacecraft. "By the 7 moons of Arcturus," someone whispered from the back of the auditorium. "It's actually flying." "Flying is a generous term," Dr. Zenvox observed cheerfully. "I'd say it's more like falling with style and excessive confidence." The ship's docking approach could charitably be described as creative. Rather than using conventional thrusters, it appeared to be propelling itself using controlled bursts from what was unmistakably a waste management system, while simultaneously employing what looked like makeshift grappling hooks to guide its trajectory. "That should not work," Professor Vel-Nossian said weakly. "The physics alone—" "And yet," Dr. Zenvox pointed out with obvious delight, "there it is, working." The ship successfully docked with a final burst of what was definitely recycled wastewater, coming to rest in Bay 7 with a gentleness that suggested either incredible skill or impossible luck. Given what they'd already heard, the audience was beginning to suspect it might be both. "Well," came Commander Ironwood's voice over the comm system, "that went better than expected. Luna, remind me to send a thank you note to whoever designed these docking bays. Very forgiving architecture." "Will do, Commander. Shall I start unloading our passengers?" "Let's give them a few minutes to recover from the docking procedure. Some of them looked a bit green around the gills, or whatever passes for gills in their species." Professor Vel-Nossian made a sound that could generously be described as a whimper. The auditorium's doors suddenly opened, admitting a figure that made several audience members instinctively reach for weapons they didn't have. The newcomer stood roughly 6 feet tall, built like someone who had personally arm-wrestled entropy and come out ahead. Their uniform was practical rather than formal, showing signs of recent repair work that seemed to have been performed with more enthusiasm than skill. "Excuse me," Commander Ironwood said, removing what appeared to be a helmet constructed from spare parts and optimism. "I'm looking for the Xenological Institute. We've got some refugees who wanted to speak with your research department." The silence that greeted this announcement was so profound, it could probably be bottled and sold as a meditation aid. "That would be us," Dr. Zenvox said finally, his amusement now barely contained. "We're actually in the middle of a lecture about human mythology. Your timing is rather fortuitous." Commander Ironwood glanced around the auditorium, taking in the assembled aliens, the holographic displays, and Professor Vel-Nossian's increasingly crystalline equivalent of a panic attack. "Oh, brilliant, we love those. Luna's always going on about how other species tell stories about us. Says it's flattering, though I keep telling her they're probably making us sound much more impressive than we actually are." Several audience members made choking sounds. Actually, the commander continued, while I'm here, don't suppose any of you know anything about quantum field stabilization? Luna's got our energy parasite contained, but she thinks the field generator might need some proper calibration. She built it from coffee machine parts, and while it works, she's a bit worried about long-term stability. You built a quantum field generator from coffee machine parts? Asked Dr. Quilshar Verintox, a crystalline being whose species was renowned for their engineering expertise. Well, Luna did. I just held the flashlight and tried not to get in the way. She's got a real gift for making things work that shouldn't. Last week she fixed our FTL drive using part of the galley equipment and some wire she found in a maintenance shaft. Professor Vel-Nossian made another sound, this one distinctly resembling the noise a theoretical framework makes when it collapses under the weight of observable reality. And speaking of our passengers, Commander Ironwood continued cheerfully, they should be ready to disembark soon. Fair warning though, some of them are a bit emotional about the whole rescue thing. Apparently being saved from certain death by what they keep calling impossible human nonsense has left them a bit overwhelmed. As if summoned by this statement, the auditorium doors opened again to admit a group of beings that represented at least a dozen different species. They moved with the careful precision of individuals who had recently had their understanding of the universe fundamentally rearranged and were still processing the implications. At the front of the group walked a tall, elegant, crystalline being whose prismatic form was cycling through colors that suggested profound gratitude mixed with existential confusion. They approached Professor Vel-Nossian with what appeared to be recognition. Professor Vel-Nossian, the newcomer asked in a voice like wind chimes caught in a philosophical crisis. I am Healer Kithara Din Solis. I believe I've read your papers on human behavioral mythology. Professor Vel-Nossian's form flickered hopefully. Perhaps this would be his salvation, a fellow academic who could confirm that what they'd all witnessed was clearly impossible. Yes, he managed weakly. I trust you found my analysis compelling. Healer Din Solis was quiet for a moment, their crystalline form shifting through what could only be described as the colors of polite, academic disagreement. Well, they said finally, having spent the last 3 days watching humans do exactly the things your papers claim are impossible, I'm afraid I might have to respectfully disagree with some of your conclusions. The sound Professor Vel-Nossian made at this point defied classification by any known system of acoustic analysis. You see, the healer continued, addressing the auditorium as much as the professor, when our passenger liner was caught in the gravitational anomaly, we calculated that rescue was mathematically impossible. The forces involved, the radiation levels, the navigational complexity, no known technology could have extracted us safely. They gestured toward Commander Ironwood, who was examining the holographic displays with obvious interest. And then these humans appeared in a ship that should never have been able to fly, using techniques that should never have worked, and proceeded to save all 47 of us through what can only be described as weaponized optimism and creative engineering. The engineering wasn't that creative, Commander Ironwood protested mildly. Luna just ignored some of the more pessimistic safety guidelines and focused on the ones about not letting people die horribly. Very practical approach, really. They surfed gravitational waves, Healer Din Solis continued, their voice taking on the tone of someone recounting a religious experience. They turned their waste management system into a propulsion device. Their engineer built a quantum field stabilizer from beverage preparation equipment. Coffee machine, Commander Ironwood corrected helpfully, though it still makes excellent coffee. Luna's very proud of that. And when we asked how they knew these impossible techniques would work, the healer continued, do you know what they said? The auditorium waited with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for natural disasters and academic scandals. They said they didn't know if it would work, they just knew they had to try, because letting people die when you might be able to help isn't really an option. The silence that followed this statement was broken only by the sound of Professor Vel-Nossian's worldview crumbling into component atoms. But that's not how science works, he whispered. You can't just ignore fundamental physical laws because you feel like helping people. Commander Ironwood tilted their head thoughtfully. Well, no, you can't ignore them, but you can work around them if you're creative enough. Luna always says that physics is more like guidelines than actual rules, especially when people are in trouble. Physics is not guidelines, Professor Vel-Nossian exclaimed, his academic distress finally overcoming his paralysis. Physics is the fundamental structure of reality. Right, but reality's pretty flexible if you approach it with the right attitude, the commander replied reasonably. Luna's got this theory that the universe is generally helpful if you're trying to do something good, even if you have to bend a few rules to make it work. Dr. Zenvox was now laughing so hard that his 6 arms were having difficulty keeping him upright. Several other audience members were beginning to look like they were reconsidering some fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. This is impossible, Professor Vel-Nossian declared, though he sounded less like he was making an academic argument and more like he was pleading with the universe to make sense again. Yeah, we get that a lot, Carmen Ironwood said cheerfully. Luna says it's because most people spend too much time thinking about why things won't work instead of figuring out how to make them work anyway. At this point, the auditorium doors opened once more to admit another human, this one wearing what appeared to be a uniform that had been recently repaired using techniques that prioritized function over appearance. They carried what looked like a small, glowing creature that seemed to be purring contentedly. "Commander, I've got the refugees settled in their temporary quarters," Engineer Luna Stormwright announced. "Also, Sparky here has been helping me recalibrate the quantum field generator. Turns out, energy parasites have an intuitive understanding of exotic matter interactions. Who knew?" She held up the glowing creature, which pulsed happily and made a sound like a contented electrical discharge. "You domesticated an energy parasite," Dr. Verentok said in the tone of someone confirming something they still couldn't quite believe. "Domesticated is a strong word," Engineer Stormwright replied. "I'd say we reached a mutually beneficial understanding. Sparky gets regular meals and companionship, and in return it helps maintain our power systems. Very eco-friendly arrangement." The creature, Sparky apparently, pulsed brighter and made what could generously be described as a happy electrical noise. "Besides," the engineer continued, "it was obviously lonely. You can't just leave a lonely creature floating in space, even if it is technically a dangerous energy-based life form that could drain our power systems in minutes if it wanted to." Professor Vel-Nossian made a sound like a crystalline being having an existential crisis, which was probably exactly what it was. "Right," Commander Ironwood said. "Luna, these fine academic folks were just discussing human mythology. Apparently there's some debate about whether the stories about us are actually true." Engineer Stormwright looked around the auditorium, taking in the holographic displays that still showed neat scientific explanations for why everything she represented was impossible. "Ooh, those are nice charts," she said appreciatively. "Very thorough, though I think there might be a small error in your calculations about human engineering capabilities." "An error?" Professor Vel-Nossian asked weakly. "Well, you've assumed that humans only use techniques that are officially approved by recognized engineering authorities," Engineer Stormwright explained. "That's not really how we work. We tend to use whatever's available and see what happens." She gestured to Sparky, who pulsed agreeably. "Take field stabilization, for instance. Your charts show that it requires specialized equipment and precise calibration procedures. And you're absolutely right if you want to do it the proper way." "There are improper ways to perform quantum field stabilization?" Dr. Verentok asked, sounding fascinated and horrified in equal measure. "Oh, loads of them. Most of them involve repurposing household appliances and crossing your fingers a lot. This particular setup uses a coffee machine, some wire I found in a maintenance conduit, and a small amount of what I like to call aggressive optimism." "Aggressive optimism is not a recognized engineering principle," Professor Vel-Nossian protested feebly. "It should be," Engineer Stormwright replied cheerfully. "Very effective for getting things to work when they theoretically shouldn't. I've used it to fix everything from life support systems to FTL drives." "You used aggressive optimism to repair faster-than-light propulsion systems?" "Well, that and some creative interpretations of safety protocols. The manual says never to use organic compounds in quantum field manipulation, but it doesn't specifically mention chocolate, so I figured there was some wiggle room." Several audience members were now making notes, though whether they were recording revolutionary engineering techniques or symptoms of human insanity remained unclear. "The important thing," Engineer Stormwright continued, "is to remember that technology wants to work. Most of the time when something breaks, it's just confused about what it's supposed to be doing. You explain it clearly, give it some encouragement, and maybe percuss it gently with a suitable implement, and usually it'll sort itself out. Percussive maintenance is not a legitimate repair technique, Professor Vel-Nossian said, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Depends on your definition of legitimate, the engineer replied. It's gotten us out of more scrapes than I can count. There's actually a whole art to it. You need to hit the right spot with the right amount of force, at the right angle. Too gentle and nothing happens. Too hard and you make things worse. She demonstrated by giving Sparky a gentle pat, which caused the creature to pulse brighter and make happy electrical noises. See, Sparky understands the principle perfectly. Commander Ironwood checked what appeared to be a chronometer constructed from spare parts and wishful thinking. Luna, we should probably let these folks get back to their lecture, he said. Don't want to take up too much of their time. Actually, Dr. Zenvox interjected, his amusement now reaching levels that were probably visible from orbit. I think our colleague here was just finishing his presentation on why human myths are scientifically impossible. All eyes turned to Professor Vel-Nossian, whose crystalline form was now cycling through colors that didn't appear in any known spectrum and probably weren't supposed to exist in normal space-time. Fine, he began, then stopped. Perhaps, Dr. Zenvox suggested helpfully, you'd like to revise some of your conclusions based on this new empirical evidence? Professor Vel-Nossian looked at his holographic displays, which still showed neat charts explaining why humans couldn't possibly do any of the things they had just witnessed them doing. He looked at the refugees who were nodding enthusiastically about their impossible rescue. He looked at Engineer Stormwright, who was having a quiet conversation with an energy parasite that was purring like a satisfied cat. This is not possible, he said finally. None of this is possible. And yet, Commander Ironwood pointed out reasonably, here we are. The universe, Professor Vel-Nossian declared with the kind of desperate certainty that comes from having one's fundamental beliefs challenged by observable reality, does not work this way. Engineer Stormwright looked thoughtful. Well, maybe the universe is more flexible than we give it credit for. I mean, if you approach it with the right attitude and don't get too hung up on the theoretical limitations, it's amazing what you can accomplish. Theoretical limitations exist for good reasons, sure, but so does helping people when they're in trouble. And when those two things conflict, well, she shrugged. I know which one I'm going with. Sparky pulsed in what appeared to be agreement. The silence that followed was broken by the slow, deliberate sound of Dr. Zenvox applauding. Magnificent, he said, his 6 arms creating a complex rhythm of appreciation. Absolutely magnificent. Colleague Vel-Nossian, I believe you've just provided us with the finest example of why field research is superior to theoretical modeling. Professor Vel-Nossian's form was now displaying colors that suggested complete academic breakdown, mixed with the dawning realization that his entire career had just been publicly demolished by 2 cheerful humans and their pet energy parasite. But my research, he whispered, my papers, my theoretical framework. Oh, I'm sure they're very good papers, Commander Ironwood said kindly. It's just that sometimes reality doesn't read the manual. Reality should read the manual, Professor Vel-Nossian protested weakly. Yeah, but it's got better things to do, Engineer Stormwright replied cheerfully. Like making impossible rescues work out and helping friendly energy parasites find new homes. Sparky pulsed happily and made a sound like contentment translated into electrical discharge. As the humans prepared to leave, taking their rescued passengers and their impossible pet with them, Professor Vel-Nossian slumped behind his podium, surrounded by holographic displays that now seemed more like monuments to academic hubris than scientific achievement. Well, Dr. Zenvox announced to the auditorium, I think we can all agree that today's presentation has been highly educational, if not in quite the way we expected. The audience began to file out, many of them engaged in animated discussions about the implications of what they'd witnessed. Several were already making notes about the need to revise various theoretical frameworks. Professor Vel-Nossian remained at his podium, staring at his charts and graphs with the expression of someone who had just watched the universe personally vandalize his life's work. Cheer up, colleague, Dr. Zenvox said, patting him gently with one of his 6 arms. Think of it this way. You've just participated in one of the most significant academic discoveries in recent history. What discovery? Vel-Nossian asked miserably. The discovery that when it comes to humans, the myths aren't mythology, they're just really good marketing. Outside the auditorium, Commander Ironwood was helping their passengers prepare for transport to their final destinations, while engineer Stormwright performed some final calibrations on equipment that should never have worked, but somehow did anyway. Nice place, the commander observed, looking around the Institute's pristine corridors. Very academic. Think they learned anything useful from our visit? Hard to say, Engineer Stormwright replied, giving Sparky another gentle pat. But I think that professor fellow might need some time to process things. His whole color spectrum went a bit wonky there at the end. Probably just needs to adjust his theoretical framework, the commander said charitably. Happens to the best of us. And as their ship departed the Institute, propelled by systems that violated several fundamental principles of engineering while somehow working perfectly anyway, the Xenological Institute of Advanced Species Studies was left to contemplate a new addition to their archives. The first recorded case of human mythology being debunked by the simple expedient of humans showing up and proving it wasn't mythology at all. Professor Vel-Nossian's lecture notes, meanwhile, were quietly filed away as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that just because something seems impossible, it actually is. The universe, it turned out, had a sense of humor about such assumptions, and wasn't above making its point with the kind of dramatic irony that would make even the most pretentious literature professor weep with envy. In the end, the only myth that got thoroughly debunked that day was the idea that humans were anything less than exactly as impossible as their legends claimed. The Xenological Institute of Advanced Species Studies had seen many ridiculous theories presented within its crystalline walls over the centuries, but none quite as entertainingly wrong as what Professor Zyth'kar Vel-Nossian was about to unleash upon his unsuspecting audience. The building itself seemed to mock the upcoming presentation, its bioluminescent architecture pulsing with what could charitably be called anticipatory glee. Professor Vel-Nossian stood 12 feet tall when fully extended, his crystalline form refracting the ambient light into prismatic patterns that he believed made him look distinguished. In reality, it made him look like a very pretentious disco ball, but nobody had bothered to inform him of this fact. His compound eyes swept across the packed auditorium, taking in representatives from 47 different species, all gathered to witness what he confidently believed would be the definitive academic takedown of human mythology. The auditorium buzzed with the particular energy that accompanies academic blood sport. In the front row sat Dr. Quilthar Zenvox, a 6-armed heliotrope whose expression of barely contained amusement should have served as a warning to anyone paying attention. Unfortunately, Professor Vel-Nossian was far too absorbed in his own brilliance to notice such trivial details as his colleague's knowing smirk. Behind them, the audience represented a cross-section of galactic academia. The methane breathers had constructed special atmospheric suits for the occasion, while the energy beings had dimmed themselves to avoid causing seizures. Even the notoriously antisocial Silicon Bays Collective had sent a representative, though whether out of genuine interest or morbid curiosity remained unclear. Professor Vel-Nossian activated his holographic display with a flourish that would have impressed absolutely no one if they weren't already committed to sitting through his presentation. The title materialized in 17 different languages: Debunking Human Mythological Absurdities, a scientific deconstruction of impossible claims. Esteemed colleagues, he began, his voice resonating through specialized translation matrices, today we shall examine the most persistent and scientifically implausible mythology to emerge from the third spiral arm, the so-called legends of human capability. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. Human myths had been a source of galactic entertainment for decades, right up there with Centaurian soap operas and Andromedan performance art in terms of their perceived relationship to reality. Through rigorous scientific analysis and biological modeling, Vel-Nossian continued, his prismatic form shifting through colors that indicated supreme academic confidence, I have conclusively proven that these tales represent nothing more than primitive wish fulfillment fantasies, grossly exaggerated beyond any reasonable biological parameters. The holographic display shifted to show a detailed anatomical breakdown of human physiology. The data, meticulously gathered from long-range bioscans and theoretical modeling, painted a picture of a species that was unremarkable in every measurable way. Average strength, mediocre reflexes, laughably fragile bone structure, and a brain that, while adequate, hardly suggested the capability for the legendary feats attributed to them. Consider, if you will, the myth of human persistence, hunting, Vel-Nossian declared, manipulating the display to show a human figure pursuing what appeared to be a much larger and faster creature. According to their folklore, humans can allegedly pursue prey across vast distances through sheer determination, eventually exhausting creatures far superior to them in speed and strength. Several audience members chuckled at the absurdity. The professor's confidence grew. Biological impossibility, he stated flatly. Human cardiovascular systems, while adequate for basic survival, could never sustain such prolonged exertion. The energy expenditure alone would result in systemic failure within the first few hours.